In the preface of Logic of Sense, Deleuze makes a strange observation. He says, "This book is an attempt to develop a logical and psychological novel." We can find a hint of what this means in the preface of his previous book, Difference and Repetition, where he makes a similar remark. A book of philosophy, he says, should be in part a very particular species of detective novel, in part a kind of science fiction. By detective novel we mean that concepts with their zones of presence should intervene to resolve local situations. They themselves change along with the problems. They have spheres of influence where they operate in relation to dramas and by means of a certain cruelty. The cruelty here mentioned is a reference to Nietzsche's view that philosophy should not be polite, it should not maintain the status quo. But on the contrary, it should question the dominant ideas that make a discipline like philosophy less creative and society more coercive. Both of these quotes show something important about Deleuze's thought, namely that a book like Logic of Sense is not just a theoretical study of sense. It's also made to be experienced in a certain way, to be felt, and that way is by forming concepts in reaction to specific problems. After all, what can be more challenging and cruel to thought, more conducive of renewal, than to apprehend an idea from the perspective of sensation? So in this video I'll make the case that Logic of Sense provides not just a description but also an experience of sense, in the same way that a detective novel provides an experience of crime and justice. And I'll show this by treating Logic of Sense as a novel, studying its main character, the Stoic master, as well as its plot, which is centered around the two geneses of sense. In Logic of Sense, there are few images as vivid as the Stoic master who inspires the so-called new image of the philosopher. Deleuze describes him at length. This new image of the philosopher shows a provocateur, one who can be quite edgy at times. Following the gossipy accounts of Diogenes Laertius, Deleuze describes this new image of the philosopher as follows. On one hand, the philosopher eats with great gluttony, he stuffs himself, he masturbates in public, regretting that hunger cannot be so easily relieved. He does not condemn incest with the mother, the sister, or the daughter. He tolerates cannibalism and anthropophagy, but in fact he is also supremely sober and chaste. On the other hand, he keeps quiet when people ask him questions or gives them a blow with his staff. If you pose abstract and difficult questions, he will respond by designating some bit of food, or will give you a whole box of food which he then will break over you, always with a blow of his staff. Yet, he also holds a new discourse, a new logos animated with paradox and philosophical values and significations which are new. Indeed, we feel that these anecdotes are no longer Platonic or pre-Socratic. This new philosopher does not simply behave in a strange and outrageous manner. He crucially points at a new way of thinking. So Deleuze says, "This is a reorientation of all thought and of what it means to think. There is no longer depth or height. The cynical and stoic sneers against Plato are many. It is always a matter of unseating the ideas, of showing that the incorporeal is not high above, en hauteur in French, but is rather at the surface, and it is not the highest cause but the superficial effect par excellence, and that it's not essence but event." Is Deleuze saying that the new philosophers inspired by the Stoics and Cynics should not think, and so that they should engage in some kind of edgy or even destructive activity for the sake of itself? No, not at all. We will see what Deleuze says about ethics in a moment, but the point of the critique of ideas, which is inaugurated by the Stoic philosophers, is to engage in the task of overturning platonism, which, as Deleuze says elsewhere, is the supreme task of modern philosophy. What does he mean by this? What he means, and this is the sense of the overturning of Platonism as a concept, is that following Plato we seem to be stuck in a strange and sterile place in which we put ourselves. In this place we overgeneralize things that we represent. We say, for example, that any and all meaning must come from propositions. And we do this because of a paralogism that Deleuze denounces in all of his writings. This paralogism is that we raise a priori certain ideas that we do in fact arrive at a fortiori. We place principles first as the conditions of our experience, when in fact they result from our experience. This reversal is not necessarily conscious. For example, when we give ourselves an object of study, we implicitly and often unconsciously give ourselves other things, such as the material world or the spiritual world, which we then elevate as principles of our experience, when in fact they are ideas produced by experience. We experience the real world before we can actually conceptualize it. Similarly, we say that we, individuals, have ideas, thus giving ourselves subjective reality, when in fact you could just as well say that ideas have us, and that in fact we experience ideas well before we experience ourselves as individuals having ideas. So when we think about something, it's crucial to look at what we do. In a quote that I like a lot, which comes from the very last two sentences of Empiricism and Subjectivity, Deleuze says this: "Philosophy must constitute itself as the theory of what we are doing, not as a theory of what there is. What we do has its principles, and being can only be grasped as the object of a synthetic relation with the very principles of what we do." Here Deleuze is insisting on this very point, that what there is, the given, cannot be grasped as such. We can only truly grasp what we do. And what we do begins in the impersonal depth. It begins before the individual is formed. In a beautiful quote from Difference and Repetition, he says this: "The domain of laws must be understood, but always on the basis of a nature and a spirit superior to their own laws, which weave their repetitions in the depth of the earth and of the heart, where laws do not yet exist." So in other words, it's not correct to say that eternal laws condition lived experience. It's just the opposite. Lived experience constructs or discovers eternal laws, which are only secondarily and by an act of thought elevated to the rank of principle or axiom. So the overturning of Platonism means to look at the story of this construction, of the discovery of laws, to look at this place where laws and individuals do not yet exist. This characteristic Deleuzian reversal does not mean that there is no truth, no laws, or no eternity as such. Events, for instance, have a kind of eternity. Truth is the product of a process, which is not to say that it's false or that it has no objective reality, but rather that truth expresses a new power, a new movement in our thinking. As Nietzsche famously warns, we look into the abyss at the risk of being looked back, that is, at the risk of being changed by it. This is, in a nutshell, the process of the eternal return. Just as a reminder, when Nietzsche describes the eternal return, he identifies 4 stages: active forces which produce affects, reactive forces which occur when active forces turn on themselves and become powerless. Third, nihilism, where reactive forces react on themselves and destroy themselves. And finally, the process of selection, by which new active forces come out of the abyss and begin a new cycle of the eternal return. Platonism is the process by which nihilistic forces react on themselves and destroy the process itself by making self-similarity, identity, analogy, or representation in general the condition of all processes, when in fact representation is a product of the process. That is, we don't represent things as they are, we don't have full access to what there is, but things are what they are only in relation to what we do with them. To experience something and know its truth means to plunge into the abyss of that thing, to be changed by it. So it is with sense. In the abyss of sense, we select ideas and then come back to the surface with a renewed perspective. To go back to our reading of Logic of Sense as a detective novel, we can say that the crime that has been perpetrated is a kidnapping of sense, and the criminal is none other than Plato himself, who put sense in the shackles of representation and nihilism. It was Platonism that inspired the circle of the proposition, which reduces sense to a linguistic determination, when in fact linguistic determinations are produced by sense. It is true that Logic of Sense is primarily a reflection on language. It presents language as a synthesis of sounds, phonemes, morphemes, semanthemes that are produced on different levels, and that produce networks of feedback effects. But Deleuze looks at language through 2 perspectives, 2 geneses in fact. One of which is static, retrospective as it were, and describes the logical and ontological nature of language, leading us below the surface to the terrifying realm of the schizoid position. If you recall, he does so in the study of Artaud's literature, but he does so intellectually. From the abyss, however, the second perspective takes place, the second genesis, which is called dynamic. From the schizoid position and the experience of schizophrenic language, the dynamic genesis leads us immediately back to the surface. That's why it's called dynamic. There is no reflection there. We have nothing to do in order to get back to the surface, to the world of representations. It just happens, like a habit. But in this process, even if we are back where we were at the beginning on the surface, something has happened, a change. We have gazed into the abyss. It's as if we were hit by the staff of the stoic master. And in this manner, Logic of Sense does not only tell us what sense is theoretically, but it shows it to us. It shows its movement. Sense, fundamentally, is living change, finding a new perspective. we bear in ourselves the counter gaze of the abyss. And this is why Deleuze is so interested in Stoicism. For Stoicism is fundamentally a philosophy of action, and it is from this active perspective that it criticizes Platonism and the tyranny of representation. Stoicism, or the Stoic master, performs this immaculate conception of sense that Deleuze describes, by which sense is liberated from sterile representation and becomes productive. Sense is not just an image or something that we think, it's a movement. It's going there and back again, the death and resurrection of philosophical thought. To be hit by the master's staff means something quite specific, namely that thought must happen fast. Deleuze says, the important thing is to do it quickly, to find quickly something to designate, to eat or to break, which would replace the signification, the idea, that you have been invited to look for. All the faster and better, since there is no resemblance, nor should there be one, between what one points out and what one has been asked. Let us compare this to the following quote by Nietzsche, where Nietzsche mocks the Platonic image of the philosopher. Platonic philosophers think of every necessity as a need, a painstaking having to follow and being forced, and they consider thinking itself as something slow and sluggish, almost a toil, and often enough worth the sweat of the noble. Not in their wildest dreams would they think of it as light, divine, and closely related to dance and high spirits. So you see, the Stoic is a fast thinker, quick on his feet, a dancer ready to meet the event as it presents itself. And he can do this because he remains impervious to anything that could turn him away from his goal, which is virtue. In replacing sluggish ideas with quickness and lightness of thought, the Stoic master fundamentally changes what it means to think, and therefore to know something. And here you might recognize certain themes that are dear to Deleuze. If we argue that ideas, such as the laws of the universe, are given in advance, we are facing a serious problem, namely that we cannot decide if something is caused by matter or by mind. Does the world exist if there is nobody to look at it? Do words produce ideas, or do ideas, including sensations, produce words? You mention a paradox quoted by Deleuze in this regard. Chrysippus, the famous Stoic master, taught, if you say something, it passes through your lips. So if you say chariot, a chariot passes through your lips. This funny quip is made to make us realize that we don't know something primarily because there is an idea for it or a word for it, because the idea or the word is not the thing, but rather to know something means to experience it first, to feel it, and only then to assign causality to it. That is the reason why Deleuze can say that to material and ideal causes we must substitute quasi-causes, causes that occur on the surface effects, which is not to say that material and ideal causes are false or purely imaginary, but rather that they are perspectives, and perspectives imply movement and action. Let us just make this observation about what Deleuze does in Logic of Sense. He provides a new perspective for at least three subdomains of philosophy. On the level of ontology and metaphysics, he provides a new theory of causality which transcends the usual material and ideal causes. He insists on the so-called quasi-cause. On the level of epistemology, Deleuze introduces a new modality, which is the problematic. Statements are not just necessary, possible, or impossible, which are the classical modalities of the statement. He argues that statements can also be problematic, meaning that they contain a problem that makes us think. A paradox, for example. Problematic statements seem to have a life of their own. Finally, on the level of ethics and morality, Deleuze develops a Stoic ethics of the event that we will see in a moment. Deleuze's critique of Platonism has the following consequences, which are all very important for Deleuzean philosophy in general. That sense and desire are not based on lack, as is the case in Plato's representationalist theory, but they are productive, they are fundamentally positive. That the laws of sense are not transcendent and given from above of all eternity, but rather they are like the rules of a game, and oftentimes, as we see in politics, to win the game means to invent and impose new rules, so the rules we follow are not eternal. There are many ways to produce sense, including with nonsense. That sense is not found in a signifier or in a formal linguistic determination, but rather sense is a distribution, it is something productive, and what is produced are problems, points of interest and focus. All of this is what it means for sense to be conveyed as an experience in Logic of Sense, and we have seen how it's done technically. However, as Nietzsche says, if you really want to know what an author or a book is about, you have to look at its ethics and its morality. So let us conclude our journey with the problem of ethics in Logic of Sense. For some reason, I keep hearing and reading that Deleuze, following Nietzsche, supposedly argues for nihilism in the sense of the destruction of all identity and morality. This is a problem because doing so implies an identity and a morality of kinds, even if they are minimal and purely antagonistic. The problem with this type of relativism is that it presents itself as an absolute, so it's a self-contradiction. If I say everything is relative, I'm making an absolute statement. So making nihilism and destruction an idol, an end in itself, would create a veneration that cannot be destroyed, since it is destruction itself. It would condemn me to the limbos of existence. Nietzsche was very aware of the inherent ambiguity of the word nihilism. Take for example this quote of his: "Either abolish your venerations or yourselves. The latter would be nihilism, but would not the former also be nihilism? That is our question mark." The ambiguity of the word nihilism is not a conceptual defect, it's a feature. It shows that it's not made to become an end in itself, a new Platonic idea, but rather it's a tool of becoming, meant to have a limited existence and a precise goal. For all these provocative statements, it's clear that Nietzsche does not argue for blind destruction and self-hate, quite the contrary. For that would mean destroying one's own power to act, and from there to become self-neutralized, purely reactive, an empty shell. Both Deleuze and Nietzsche vigorously condemn this inevitable consequence of slave mentality, to hate and resent oneself and the world. Deleuze, for instance, likes to quote a man named Joe Bousquet, who was a soldier in World War I and who got shot in the spine at the age of 19, which left him completely paralyzed up to the chest. His life was spent almost entirely in a bed, in a dark room with shutters closed. But in spite of his terrible wound, Bousquet became a renowned poet and philosopher. Here's what Deleuze says about him. Joe Bousquet must be called stoic. He apprehends the wound that he bears deep within his body in its eternal truth as a pure event. To the extent that events are actualized in us, they wait for us and invite us in. They signal us, "My wound existed before me, I was born to embody it," which is a famous line by Bousquet. It is a question of attaining this will that the event creates in us, of becoming the quasi-cause of what is produced within us, the operator, of producing surfaces and linings in which the event is reflected, finds itself again as incorporeal, and manifests in us the neutral splendor which it possesses in itself in its impersonal and pre-individual nature, beyond the general and the particular, the collective and the private. It is a question of becoming a citizen of the world. Stoic virtue means to will the event, to be up to what happens to us, even if it's a terrible wound or even death. It doesn't mean that we have to be successful in life, insofar as success is defined by the standards of the day, but rather that we should become able to look at the world without hate and resentment, to destroy only what makes us avoid the event, so that ultimately we can become able to say yes to life, that is, to become fully alive. Let us give the final word to Nietzsche, who says this: "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, love of fate. Let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer." Here ends our study of logic of sense. There's a million other things to say about this splendid book, and we have barely scratched the surface, but my goal in these very short presentations was just to give you a taste of it, and perhaps convey the desire to read or reread it, and experience for yourself this joyous litany of liberation and optimism. I hope at any rate that this study was somewhat useful to you. In the future, I will try to make shorter videos, so that I can publish at least one video per week on this channel. As for now, thank you for watching, and see you soon.